Um, so good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the event. And just before we start with the event, I'll go through some housekeeping, and then we'll welcome all, and specifically our panel speakers. So the webinar, just to let you know that the webinar will be recorded in order that others can view the material via the EIS website at a later date. We would therefore ask that if you do not want your image to appear, please ensure that your camera is turned off, and the chat will be saved for the Education and Equality Department's use in addressing matters raised via this channel, but will not be published. We ask all our webinar participants to be respectful and use language appropriate for a professional live event, and to keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking. After our panel speakers, there will be a breakout session where you can discuss these topics in further detail with your colleagues, and hopefully we will generate some questions for a Q&A session with our panel members. You can use the chat function at any time, and please do so to record your questions for our panel speakers. EIS colleagues will be there to collate these questions, so I will read them out for the panel, and we will try to answer as many as possible in the space of this afternoon's webinar. If you can keep your questions short and concise, that will help a lot. And please remember to indicate who the question is for, unless you think it's for the whole panel to address. If you would like to ask the question yourself, please indicate so. And if members have any specific tech queries, the webinar is being supported by admin host under EIS Union 3, who you can chat directly to. I'll move on to just formally setting the scene for our webinar. This is the second webinar in the EIS webinar series, responding to the growing call for and commitment to anti-racist efforts in our schools, our workplaces, and the wider society by discussing anti-racism in education. This all-member webinar will consider the concept of allyship and discuss what difference we can all make to further anti-racism with our institutions and beyond. And folks, I guess the important thing from this webinar is that we will be hopefully having discussions around the systemic nature of racism. Oftentimes we tend to attribute racist incidents or comments to one particular bad individual, or we think bad people engage in racist behaviour, but it's actually more the systemic, wider, institutional, structural racism that we're wanting to dismantle and disrupt. So before we even begin to develop allyship, we need our institutions, our senior leaders, our peers to consider what it means to have privilege and how that manifests within the context of anti-racist work. So essentially, who has it? And when we define privilege, and power, really, it's about the right or exemption from liability or duty granted as a special benefit or advantage to a particular group of people. And this institutional privilege and power often ends up having one person or group benefiting at the expense of another. And when we think about that in the context of white privilege in anti-racist work, then Peggy McIntosh talks about it as the invisible knapsack that whites carry, oblivious to the advantages. Now, just a point to note there, that oftentimes when I'm working with my own student teachers, we talk about this invisible nature of privilege, and that 99.9% of my student teachers will have that privilege but be oblivious to it. And so therefore it's about checking in with that and being more aware of it, so that you are able to work together to dismantle some of the practices that are racist in nature. And I'm going to give you a very brief example of what I mean in terms of privilege. For schools, particularly teachers pronouncing your name correctly, reading stories that reflect your lived experiences and the assumptions that we make about young people's competency depending on the community that they come from. So just to be very mindful of that in terms of how it manifests within schools. The privilege of being a bystander, and I hope that some of our discussions will unpack this, because when we want to talk about allyship, we absolutely need to be thinking about that your role in standing with your fellow peers, your silence means you're complicit, and we mustn't remain silent when it comes to allyship. So there's also a notion of, uncomfortableness, and you will have a chance, for some of you, if you don't go into the breakout rooms, to watch a short video from Robin DiAngelo, who talks about white fragility. And in that, she talks about that dominant position that whites are almost always racially comfortable, and thus have developed unchallenged expectations to remain so, where they've not had to build tolerance for racial discomfort. And thus, when racial discomfort arises, they typically respond as something is wrong and blame the person or event that triggered that discomfort. So it's often that, my goodness, I don't have a racist bone in my body. How could you possibly suggest that I have made that comment? And suddenly what happens is that the victim becomes set out as the perpetrator. And we'll hopefully explore that in more deeper later. I guess this leads us nicely on to allyship, which is the purpose of our webinar here, to think about what does it mean to be an ally? What does it mean to be an effective white ally in these conversations? So an ally are individuals who belong to a dominant social group, and through their support of non-dominant groups, actively work towards the eradication of prejudicial practices that they witness in both their personal and professional lives. So to be an effective white ally, Nado Aveling, who's a renowned academic in America, who says, and she's a white academic, and I make that point because she says, as soon as we start talking about whiteness as systemic, then what we're actually doing is we're hacking at our very roots, because we're asking ourselves to interrogate our own racialized, gendered and class-based positioning. We need to examine how whiteness functions and develop a more nuanced understanding of race and racism and whiteness. So in terms of allyship, walking the talk, developing an anti-racist consciousness through listening to counter-narratives and moving beyond what often sometimes can be a level of defensiveness, a level of guilt, to a space where we can become effective white allies. Now, that brings me on to introducing our very first speaker for this afternoon. And it's Larry Flanagan, our EIS General Secretary. Larry is the General Secretary of the Education Institute of Scotland, Scotland's largest education union for teaching and lecturers. Until taking up the post of General Secretary, Larry was Principal Teacher of English and Drama at Hillhead High School, Glasgow, and has 33 years' experience as a class teacher. He is the author of 3 English textbooks published by Lecky and Lecky, and he served on the Curriculum for Excellence Management Board throughout the formative years of the programme. So welcome, Larry, and we're looking forward to your contributions.
Okay, thanks very much, Khadija, and good afternoon, colleagues. Thanks for being here, and thank you for the invitation to speak. It's interesting just listening to Khadija's opening, because to be honest, I'd be quite happy for you just to speak, Khadija, and for me to listen to you. When Andrea asked me to speak, I had to be persuaded a little, because I have to confess the term white ally is not one that I'm particularly familiar with. And it's interesting just in your opening, Khadija, that even the adjective white is not, I'm not used to being described as white anything. So that in itself is challenging in the way that you referenced there. But the language of discourse around race and anti-racism does change, has changed significantly over the decade to reflect different threads of argument. But Andrea basically said to me, well, you just go on and talk about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and those who are on the call can judge whether or not you're an ally. So the term itself maybe one that more of you are familiar with, but it might be well describing something that others have been doing for a while without necessarily calling in that. So I'm not coming with any specific insight or expertise around it, but I am now General Secretary of the EIS. I'm on the STUC General Council, I'm on the TUC General Council. So I'm in a position of authority and leadership across quite significant trade union bodies. And it would probably be interesting for you to hear my perceptions of how anti-racism is dealt with within these structures, because some of it, I think, is illustrative of good practice and ways in which things can be taken forward, but some of it probably reflects quite dated ways of working, which in themselves create potential barriers in relation to how anti-racism, which is an accepted agenda across the board, is actually tackled and taken forward. So almost every trade union body now would have different equality work streams and ad hoc committees or subcommittees to take that forward. And I think these have been proven to be, across all equalities issues, highly effective vehicles for engaging people with lived experience in all of the equality work streams, and articulating that into an input into the policy making and the performances of the trade union bodies. But there is always a risk, I think, that they also become silos. And because you have an anti-racism work stream, you can tick a box and say we're dealing with that here, but actually a lot of your other structures don't change very much. And you quite often see that in terms of the composition of even bodies like the EIS. So teaching is underrepresented in terms of members of the profession from Black and minority ethnic background. So that means that EIS DIPSO is the same, because we reflect the profile across teachers. But even in terms of, you look at the EIS staffing, our admin staff and so forth, we actually have a very low percentage of people from a minority ethnic background. And there's a question to be asked here, I think, around, well, are we doing enough to actually challenge that in terms of our own internal structures? We used to be underrepresented in terms of gender, in terms of our officer structures, and that's changed because of a conscious effort to make it change. And I think part of what allyship is actually reflecting upon these types of issues and then doing something to change what has been quite often an established norm across a number of years. I'm now old enough to remember back to trade unions when quite a number of them were far from being progressive in their attitudes across quite a number of issues. And there's been a significant change in that, but I do think we still need to do more, and we need to do more in terms of our own memberships also, not just to have a profile around anti-racism, but actually to address racism within the trade union movement, because it clearly still exists in large pockets of people who declare themselves to be trade unionists, and we have to not only be a voice to challenge racism in wider society, but also to be looking at challenge it within our own membership. Prior to being General Secretary, as Khadija alluded to there, I was a classroom teacher. I was also, as an EIS activist, education convener for 7 or 8 years. And actually, I think in terms of the EIS and its anti-racism work, that's probably the most critical role as a lay activist in terms of the impact that the EIS can have on promoting anti-racism within education. And I think that is a critical role for the Institute. So we, as a trade union, we have a responsibility as an organisation to be part of a broader challenge, societal challenge around racism. But as a professional association, in terms of our own members, I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of education settings to make sure that we are, as an institution and as a profession, actually supporting the challenges that are necessary in the way that Khadija outlined in the introduction. For 2 years in the 80s, which I realise, looking at some of the faces, means some of you were born, but in the 80s I was teaching, and for 2 years I was seconded out of school to work for Strathclyde Region as what was called a staff tutor in multicultural and anti-racist education, or Macari for short. Some of you might have been around at that time. I was happily known as Larry Macari through Ayrshire for 2 years, and my job as part of a Strathclyde team was to deliver in service to professionals across a range of settings, from preschool, primary, secondary, colleges, on anti-racist initiatives. And it was a really informative period, not only in the sense of getting a better picture of the whole education system, so coming from a secondary background, you can have quite a narrow experience, but also in terms of the attitudes that you came across in the profession, because they were sometimes quite shocking in relation to. Now, I was also a political activist in the 80s, so challenging racism was part of my kind of mindset around my politics. But you would go into schools and you would do staff meetings, and you could sense the hostility sometimes around the fact that they were being made to do this professional learning on anti-racism. And people would say things, well, there's no black people in our school. And that was, it took a while to realise, what lay behind that comment. And particularly in Ayrshire, because I'd quite often get resentment that I was focused on issues around minority ethnic, but I wasn't dealing with sectarianism, because people had experience of Irish Catholic prejudice, or I remember doing a school in Arran where people were complaining because I hadn't dealt with anti-English sentiment in Arran because of the changing nature of the population there. And thinking back to it, there was a real resistance to the idea of anti-racism, which in the 80s was a discourse that developed as a kind of challenge to multiculturalism. So multiculturalism was seen as very much, a positive. Let's celebrate the festivals. Let's understand one another. Anti-racism had a much harder political line around actually challenging people's ideas, challenging people's thinking, and looking at how the curriculum basically reflected whiteness and reflected in certain areas the history of Britain in a very particular way, and in saying to people, well, Khadija mentioned there about the kind of books that people read. So it was a real challenge getting people to present literature from any other perspective than a kind of white British perspective. And in maths, trying to get people to understand that you could, the history of maths actually has much to say about the white narrative around knowledge, given that most of the mathematical concepts developed, elsewhere in terms of the UK. So all of these issues from the 80s continue to echo today. Now, I think there's been a lot of progress from the 80s, and I know sometimes people will think that hasn't happened, but there has been progress. We spent a lot of time, I remember, in Strathclyde introducing a programme called Tackling Racist Incidents Within the Education Sector, and it was mandatory training across the board, and it was the first time there'd been any protocol established around dealing with racist incidents and recording it and doing follow-up work. And we got it established in the 80s. And we got movement on the curriculum in certain areas. But it was only about 4 or 5 years ago the EIS did a survey of local authorities around their anti-racist education work streams and discovered that they'd almost all disappeared. They'd all been subsumed into generic equalities agendas. And the very detailed work that had been there in the 80s had now been set aside. So there has been progress, but there has been regression as well. And when you look now, I think some of the battles that are being fought now are echoes of battles that, in some ways we thought we had made progress on in the past. I do think there's been progress in a general sense. I think there's a much greater awareness. I think we have a stronger foundation in time challenging racism. I think even nowadays, where if pupils use racist language in the classroom, they'll quite often be doing it deliberately because they actually want to offend. Whereas in the 80s, they quite often did it because without totally oblivious to the fact of what they were saying was offensive. So there's a different dynamic around some of what is happening now. And just by chance, I happened to be watching Lenny Henry on television doing a race through comedy, which was kind of look back on comedy from the late 60s, television comedy, and even charting the change in attitudes around that, I think does indicate that some level of progress has been made. To move to a kind of conclusion, I did have a think about what white ally might mean, and because I'm an English teacher, I decided to go with some alliteration around 3 S's. The first, I think, is about solidarity, and I come from a trade union and left background, so solidarity for me is quite an easy concept to consider, and I think in relation to anti-racism, that's just a kind of extension of values that, from a political perspective, I would hold to begin with. Andy Hargreaves, whom some of you might know, the educationalist, sent me an article he'd published in Canada a couple of days ago, which was called 4 Reasons Why We've Stopped Talking About the Working Class and Why We Shouldn't Have. And I responded to him, just a few comments saying, I agreed with what he was saying. And he emailed me back, and it was quite interesting for somebody who's living in North America, because his comment was, we have to stop the issues of race and class becoming too divergent. Now, not everyone will agree with that, but from from my perspective, that is, I think, important because there is a commonality there in terms of solidarity and struggle, which for the trade unions, I think, is an important catalyst in terms of what we need to be doing. And it is interesting as the USA goes to the polls, just to think back on some of the images we've seen on television, because I struggle when I see African Americans standing with banners for Trump and placards for Trump You know, there's a disconnect in my head around what their lived experience must be in the USA that would still lead them to support somebody like Donald Trump. And you know, I'd be interested. You know, I don't have an answer to this, so I'd be interested in people's views on it, because clearly institutional racism doesn't only affect one group in society or one class in society, but I do think there is a disproportionate impact upon working class people from a minority ethnic background in relation to that absence of power in terms of our dynamics. As I say, I'd be interested in people's thoughts, because you know, we do have to challenge ourselves around our thinking, particularly if you're speaking from a position of white privilege. Again, I don't want you to think I spent all my time looking at television, but I was watching A Vega News for You on Friday evening, and one of the contestants was a Baroness Worsley, who's a Tory Baroness, and I thought she was very witty, and you know, that was one of my prejudices, because as soon as I heard she was a Tory, I just was inclined to dislike her, but it turned out she was quite a warm kind of person, and I'm sure she's a very privileged background in one sense, but I'm also certain that she will have had experiences of racism in her life, you know, so there is a dynamic there that we need to reflect upon, I think. My second desk, very quickly, is just support about being proactive, understanding your own privileged position. And the third was around, it's around silence, and then, you know, I'm well aware that silence is complicity. So I made it silence and speech, which gives me 4 S's, so that's even better in terms of my alliteration. But I think there are times when white allies need to be silent and listen to what has been said by people with lived experience. I attended an EIS anti-racism event not that long ago, but it was when we were still in person, and we had you know, a speaker there talking about his lived experience as an Asian Scot, and the first 4 people who chose to speak were all white males. Now, they'll put their hands up and they get picked. But there's a bit of me going like, maybe you should be quiet for a minute and listen to what other people have got to say. You know, and I will confess, I am never slow to put my hand up to speak, but I think sometimes silence is more appropriate. But then the other side of it is to speak out, is to support colleagues, and we still have far too many incidents of casual racism in schools and in the staff room. You know, a member of my own family who works in a Glasgow school contacted me and said to me, "You'll never believe what somebody's posted on the staff chat book," and it was an out-and-out racist cartoon, which would be offensive to most of the staff, but in particular because it was aimed at it was a kind of play on Chinese language, to one of the staff who's from Hong Kong, and you know, and my son said to me, I'm going to speak to the head teacher," and I said, "You're quite right, and you should speak to the person who you're pretty sure will be upset by this," and for that still to be happening, you know, in a Glasgow school today, I think is a challenge. So we do need to make sure that we are speaking out, and that we are making those challenges. I'm probably way over my time, so I'm going to stop, Khadija, but I think, you know, the key point, I think, is from an EIS point of view, we have a significant responsibility, both as trade union, as part of a broader challenge to racism in society, but also, I think, as an education union, because I think what we do as professionals in the school is critical to shaping thinking of future young Scots, and that's as important as the work we do as a trade union organisation. So I'll be looking forward to the question and answer session and be interested to hear people's views on the topic. Thanks, Khadija.
That's great. Thank you so much, Larry. And yes, you were over time, but you're allowed to be. Larry, you've mentioned a number of points there which are really important, and just maybe to ponder very quickly before I introduce our next speaker. You mentioned at the very beginning not having to perhaps or think about or describe your ethnic identity as white, yeah, and that's absolutely, and that's probably what the norm has been, Larry, where you're not having to think about that. But as I had put in the chat earlier, that you'll find that obviously many BME teachers or professionals have to navigate that ethnic identity on a day-to-day basis. And so when I'm working with, again, my student teachers in my capacity as their educator, we do think about that, and I'll say to them often that you might feel uncomfortable because I'm raising this. You may never have had to think about the colour of your skin, but it's really important that we turn that gaze and begin to think about what that looks like. The frustrations, I think, that set in for BME staff really is the frequent relapses and inconsistencies in the support that sometimes we often receive from our fellow peers. And again, that's worth noting. But certainly from an EIS perspective, there's been lots of activities, some lots of promising things being done. And I totally agree with your comments about the disconnect when you see people of colour supporting Donald Trump. And we are all sitting at the edge of our seats thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow with the elections. But we also have, remember, closer to home, our equalities minister who made that comment around critical race theory, that the teachers or educators, academics who use that are essentially going against the law. And for me as an academic, critical race theory is a theory that underpins my research. And for me, if you stop people talking about this, you're moving to that authoritarianism, which actually, when that happens, it goes after all our ideas, it goes after our speech, and we need to be mindful of that. So again, perhaps maybe there's something worth noting here. Why do we feel that some of our BME colleagues feel the need to do that? Perhaps it's to do with the assimilationist policies that we have in place, our structures that encourage people to try to fit in. And therefore they think that there's no other thing for them to do is to fit in for fear of any implications. So it'll be interesting to see if Tony might pick up on some of that. And without further ado, I'm going to invite our next speaker, Tony Adams. Tony, originally from Sierra Leone, Tony graduated with a BA in African Political Systems and American History at a time when the university in Freetown was known as the Athens of West Africa for its excellence in education. Following university, Tony taught history and government in secondary schools. In 1987, he moved to the UK, and in 2006, he moved to Glasgow, where he now works as a lecturer at Glasgow City College, teaching ESOL, Communication and Media Studies. Tony is here today representing the STUC Black Workers Committee. And Tony, I'm really pleased to see you here today, because obviously you're a good friend of mine and a great colleague. So welcome to our session, and we look forward to your contribution. Over to you, Tony.
Okay, I'll leave. Thank you very much, Khadija. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Yeah. First of all, thanks to the EIS for organizing this event and the Black Workers Committee for giving me the opportunity to take part in this webinar. I don't know if I deserve it, but my only credentials here today is sincerity, because like as people were talking earlier on, it's my lived experience, if you like. So the topic here is side by side in allyship, which for me really all throughout, I mean, almost 3 decades now, do you know what I mean? That has been the bane of my life, so to speak. So I intended to give my own definition of what allyship is about, and then talk around what I perceive to be racism, which is obviously a social construct, And before I even go further, I would like to put some caveats that race is not a biological category. Race, right, is not a scientific category. I mean, that's where I'm coming from, right? But before we consider allyship, I think it is important to recognize and acknowledge that we live in a racialized society. So even though we may not feel trained to become anti-racist educators, remaining silent is not an option. Dr. Ibram Kendi, in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, puts it bluntly: we are all either racist or anti-racist. There's not such thing as not racist. Kevin Courtney of the National Education of Union goes even further. He says, you cannot be a good teacher if you are not anti-racist. As painful as it is to admit, each one of us has deeply held racial biases as a result of growing up or living in a society that privileges whiteness or blackness. So, what is allyship? The definition of allyship for me that resonates with me is from PeerNet BC. It's a website, I think it's Vancouver, Canada. They define allyship as an active, consistent, and challenging practice of unlearning and re-evaluating, in which a person of privilege seeks to work in solidarity with marginalized group. Allyship is not an identity. It is a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups. Allyship is not self-defined or work and our efforts. It's not self-defined. Our work and our efforts must be recognized by the people we seek to ally ourselves with. I'm going to talk now a little bit about race from my own perspective and how I see it, because as I said, I put some caveats. For me, it's not a scientific category. It's not a biological category. For me, there's only one race, and that is the human race. Race, therefore, is obviously a social construct. And what I usually when I look at race, I look at it as a social construct. If you peel the layers, you will find the following 5 elements in the subtext. And I have an acronym for it, right? And the acronym simply is plebs. So race is about power, and I'll talk about power a little bit later on. Language, economics, bias, and stereotype. Power, I'll talk about language. We can, Frantz Fanon, the mathematician, psychiatrist, psychologist, and he said language is the devil that has gone hoary in the flesh. I mean, we can take that to another level, but, economics, we can simply say, one academic particular I had listened to said, follow the money, you follow the history. Follow the money, you follow the history. Bias is obviously pretty straightforward. And stereotypes, we all know about these things. If we in these days, we talk about that. So race is a social construct. It is about power. The sociologists like Haralambous and Michael Haralambous and Martin Holborn, they tell us that any social relationship which involves power differentials is political. For them, this political relationships would extend from parents assigning domestic chores to their children, to teachers enforcing discipline in the classroom, from a manager organizing a workforce to a generally ordering troops, to a general ordering troops in battle. I will add that humankind is a political being. I mean, I personally believe, that a human being is a relationship, right? The late Brazilian educator and author of the best-selling book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, in his Education for Critical Consciousness, had this to say: existence is a dynamic concept implying eternal dialogue between man and man, between man and the world, between man and his creator. It is this dialogue which makes of man an historical being. Now, if race is a social construct, and it is about plebs, like I said, power, language, economics, bias, and stereotype, I will argue that it has developed a life of its own, because it is something that is taught as part and parcel of a whole socialization process. And it is significant to note that the category of race is not static, as Larry was mentioning earlier on saying, but it's fluid, as social and historical formation. Therefore, it must be unlearned. So now, how do I perceive racism? I think racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on a social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race. So how does this social construct, race works? It works in three ways. It unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. Secondly, it unfairly advantages other individuals and communities. Thirdly, which is much important, it saps the strength of the whole society through a waste of human resources. So these are the three levels that I've perceived racism, so-called construct, operate. But for the three levels, it can be broken down to, right? We need to talk about what Khadija mentioned earlier: the institutionalized form of racism, the personally mediated form of racism, the internalized form of racism. Now, institutional racism can be enacted and manifested when there is a differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of a society by race, hence it's a construct. It has no identifiable perpetuator. Examples of sectors that it can be enacted in are housing, education, employment, medical facilities, information resources, and voice. Because, I think the Black History Month lecture was given by Graham Campbell. He was talking about representation. How do marginalized communities represent them? How do they get to have a voice? So institutionalized racism, therefore, exploits the association between social class and race. What Larry mentioned earlier on, do you know what I mean? Because I was in sync with him when he was talking, not in my head. Yeah, because that's the way I view it. Then now the second point is personal mediated racism. Yeah, personal mediated racism can be enacted and manifested when there are differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race. Acts of doing and not doing and the unintentional are all ways in which this kind of racism can be enacted and manifested. because the differential actions are based on those assumptions, this can lead to prejudice and discrimination. Now for the third form, internalized racism. This is the acceptance by the stigmatized so-called racists, because obviously for me there's only one human race, the stigmatized racists of negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth. This leads to self-devaluation, resignation, and hopelessness. And finally, to the accepting limitations of their full humanity. I was going to end by, because for me, this has been my journey, if you like. It's been my journey, you know, and so that this is how I perceive. So I was going to end with my story, which is quite a long story, but I've clipped it short. If you could hear me, do I have still more time? Am I going over time?
Sorry, just another minute, Tony, if that's okay.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. You know, do you know what I mean? I mean, I could just round up and say, you know, I was going to talk about myself, my journey in my career and things like that. That's that, you know, I mean, and I also had some quotes to show. So maybe that, because to me, these things for me should be a dialogue, you know what I mean? Rather than me talking at people, you know. So I could share the slides for this 1 minute, if you could permit me. For the 1 minute, is that okay?
Yes, Tony, on you go.
Do I have, okay. Quotable quote. Okay. All right. Can you see, this is just for the debate, if people are interested in the question and answer, you know. I've got here Angelo, right? It is impossible to struggle for civil rights and equal rights for blacks without including whites. So again, what Larry was talking about there earlier on, it is about solidarity, because the trade union ethos is about solidarity, right? And then obviously she's dead. The next person I have there is Bobby Seale, an American political activist and author of Seize the Time, which is a good book. We're talking about books, educating yourself as a way of moving forward to try to learn about other cultures and, you know, and other struggles, you know, to help build up the anti-racist movement as we move forward beyond the bad racists that Khadija was mentioning. He says you don't fight racism with racism. The best way to fight racism is with solidarity. I mean, to echo what Larry was saying. And then I've got Unite's, which these are the things that resonate with me. Unite's objective is to collectivize our communities and link our community activity with our industrial activity, so there's no separation between what we do at work and what we do in our community. And then this one is from the British Chamber of Commerce. According to the British Chamber of Commerce, the next generation of business owners must be born global with language skills. Obviously, I teach English as a second language as well. And then the last one, which I think will resonate more with you, Khadija, because you were flashing Angela Saini's book the other day at the conference. For millennia dominant societies, have had the habit of believing their own people to be the best. Deep down, the more powerful they become, the more power begins to be framed as natural as well as cultural. When you see how power has shaped the idea of race, then you can start to understand its meaning. And that's in the blurb of a book which I think is well recommended for people to read. Thank you very much for listening to me and giving me this opportunity to talk to you. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Tony. Much appreciated. And you've raised a number of points there, which I'll just very quickly go over before we invite our next speaker. I'm just conscious of our time. You raised a really important issue that race absolutely is a contested term. So therefore it's a need for us to begin to understand really how racism manifests, how the roots of racism in terms of colonialism, imperialism. So that's really important. You also talked about something that's really important, and that's accountability, Tony. And any work that is in support of developing anti-racist practice has to centre on accountability. Who is taking this work forward? How do we check in with ourselves to make sure that progress is being made, and that we don't lapse into a false sense of complacency, thinking that things are okay, particularly where we have schools where the majority of our young people are white and our staff are from a white ethnic background, because we mustn't err on that actually there's no problem here. It's those very schools that need to have those conversations around race and racism. And you've rightly brought up Angela Saini's book. Fantastic, highly recommended, folks. Even if you have time just to read the foreword, it's great. She talks very quickly about her standing in the British Museum and questioning why artifacts from all over the world are kept in these glass cabinets within a museum in Britain, when why should they not be in the places where they rightfully belong? And that perhaps adds to the conversation around privilege, around power, and ownership. So with that in mind, thank you so much, Tony, for your input. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Gemma Clark. Gemma is a primary teacher and an EIS member who has been teaching in Inverclyde since 2017. She is currently studying for her Masters in Education and undertaking research on gender equality in the primary setting. Gemma became more aware of the importance of allyship after reading a book recommended by one of her university lecturers a few years ago, and has been working on anti-racist teaching and allyship since then. Welcome, Gemma, and we look forward to your contribution. Tony, can I ask you to stop sharing the screen?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Gemma, we can hear you.
Can you see my screen?
No, hang on. Sorry.
We'll need Tony to stop sharing.
Yeah, I done it.
Thank you, Tony, thanks. 10 out of 10.
Sorry, I can't really. Can you see my screen now?
Not at the moment, Gemma.
Okay. Just try to share my screen. Sorry, just trying to fix it.
That's all right, Gemma. Have you clicked on your PowerPoint as it's open, and that sometimes helps us to trigger it onto your screen?
Is it there now? No.
No.
Selma, have we made Gemma co-host for the meeting?
Yeah.
Yes, she's co-host. Gemma, I can share your PowerPoint from my computer if you would prefer, if that would be useful.
Yeah, will we do that?
Yeah, and
Thank
just give me a wave or a nudge and I'll click to the next slide.
Okay, thanks.
Great.
That's great, thank you. Hi, I'm Gemma. I think I'm showing up as Elizabeth because I'm on my mother-in-law's laptop, but okay, thanks. Thanks. If we could move on to the next one. Great. So I don't feel like I'm an expert in any of this stuff at all. So I'm just going to talk about the things that I've learned so far, the things that I've become aware of as I've been trying to commit to anti-racist practice, and also talk about some books, things that have influenced me, and some activists that have influenced me as well. Thanks. So racism's obviously been very topical lately with the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah.
It's been everywhere. People have been having a discussion about it, and it's been making me more aware of how I could try and improve my own practice within school, to be an anti-racist educator. Sorry, I keep trying to change the screen myself. So that makes me think about education in Scotland and whether Scotland is a racist country or not. And I've always thought that it's not, and been quite proud of that, thinking of Scotland as a bit of a utopia where we don't have problems with racism. And I've been reflecting on that quite a lot lately. So the term refugee comes from Scotland, this term that took off and became popular on social media about how refugees are welcomed in Scotland, and we call them refugees, and they're made welcome here and they become one of us, and that's the image that we like to have of this country, that's how things are here. But when you dig a bit deeper, you realise that there is a lot of that, but there's also a lot of race problems here as well. So what is racism? I think a problem is that we don't really know what racism is. We think we do, but our understanding of it is very narrow. So we think when we as white people think about racism, we think it's these people carrying swastikas with skinheads and tattoos, and it's something that happens in America and the southern states, and it's not something that happens here, and it's not something that we participate in. So I can move on to the next slide, thanks. Also, I suppose most of us really like to think that we're not racist either, and we can probably think of all kinds of reasons and examples why we're not. And I'm sure most of us as kind of well-meaning teachers will teach about people like Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King at some point in the year. We talk about these people and we like and admire these people, and again we think racism isn't anything to do with me, it's these skinheads, it's these bad, easily recognisable people, it's nothing to do with us. Next slide, please. So the book that I read that really kind of changed my thinking and opened my eyes a lot is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Renee Lodge. So that was very interesting and eye-opening to read. She speaks a lot about the harder to spot racism, things about people being accused of playing the race card. We think that racism is something that bad, horrible people do. Good people can't possibly be racist. We're not like that. We think about it again as being something that happens somewhere else, not here in Scotland. And it made me reflect on a conversation that I had with a friend of mine a few years ago. We were talking about racism, and we were talking about America, and some kind of things that happen in England as well. And I said, yeah, but I mean, it's not really like that here, is it? There's no problems here. He kind of explained to me that it does happen here. You're just not aware of it because you walk through the world with white skin. You don't get stopped at airports. You don't get dirty looks. You don't get insinuations made. You don't have things said about the religion that you might follow. You don't get comments about terrorism all the time. It's like, this is a really racist place. But like, if you're white skinned, you just don't see it. We can move on to the next one, thanks. So I don't know if you can see that properly, but I think this is a really helpful diagram to understand that the things that we think of as white people when we think about racism, it's very much just the tip of the iceberg. We think of things like hate crime, physical attacks, the things that we've seen like the murders of Black people in America, but we don't tend to think so much as the things down at the bottom of the pyramid. So things like saying that there's two sides to every story, or it's just a joke, no one's been harmed by it, or I'm not into politics, it's political to talk about these things. I think the kind of notion that talking about race at all is a political thing is a bit of a problem, because that's sort of like it lets you off with it. You think that's politics and I'm not interested in that and that's nothing to do with me. Thanks. So again, you hear this all the time, accusing people of playing the race card. When people complain about anything, rather than just believe them, they get accused of playing the race card as if it's this magic card that they can just pull out. So white privilege is another term that seems to be a bit contentious lately as well. if you look at conversations online, a lot of people saying, well, I don't have privilege, where's my privilege? I'm from a hard working class background. You know, you're not privileged just because you're white. And people don't think about that class privilege and race are two different things, and that you can be affected by both. So just because you're white, it doesn't mean that you've had an easy life. It means that your life hasn't been made harder by the colour of your skin. Thanks. So something else that really influenced me a lot was a TED talk that I listened to by Pran Patel. So the class that I've got just now is really diverse. I love the class, and personally, you know, we've been embracing the cultures of the class. We've been learning Arabic and things like that. And again, I think that, you know, you like to think that these are, you know, and they are good things, but there's always kind of more that you can do. When I watched this TED talk by Pran Patel, it made me realise that there's a lot of people's contributions that we just don't know about and that we don't recognise. And this TED talk, he was talking about how someone at school when he started university had said to him, so what contribution have your people made to anything? Like, this white student had already learned this superiority, and that students from other ethnic backgrounds have been done a disservice because they haven't been able to learn about the contributions that people from their culture have made. And that made me think a bit more in practice as well. Like, do I even know any scientists who aren't white? Do I know artists who aren't white? Do I talk about these people? Do I know, you know, have I just kind of been consumed by this sort of whitewashed curriculum and not learned any better, and I'm not delivering any better? So Pran speaks a lot about decolonising the curriculum. And that's something that I've tried to kind of be really aware of this year, moving forward. Next slide, please. So that's led me to reflect and make some changes in my own classroom. I've got a primary 7-6 class, and we're looking at World War II this year. And I wouldn't normally have thought about the Indian Army. So I did a bit of research into that, and I didn't even realise just how instrumental the Indian Army were in the Allies winning World War II, and also how exploited India were in this role. So I did teach my class about that, but it wasn't easy to find any resources. All the kind of normal resources, places that you go to, like Twinkle, will have PowerPoints about World War II, Remembrance Day, all the things that you need, but there was nothing about the Indian Army. You have to go out of your way to look for this information and create resources yourself because they're just not readily available. Also, Princess Sophia Duleep Singh. I've taught about the suffragettes so many times, and I've never heard of this person. You need to go out there and look for the information. It's not there. A lot of the resources that we use as teachers is still very whitewashed. It doesn't have the contributions of other people in it. So the cycle continues. You keep on teaching the quite colonised whitewashed curriculum. Thanks. So through learning these things, it's made me more aware, especially with interactions on social media, and I became particularly aware of it earlier this year. A friend of mine had shared something on a Facebook group, and it was about implicit bias. So the thing that my friend shared had two people speaking in English. I think one was Norwegian and one was perhaps Indian, but she pointed out that only the non-white person was being subtitled, but they were both speaking excellent English. And she said that it was good for us to consider this example of racial bias. So when the post was shared straight away, a lot of white people, men especially, were very quick to jump on to say that you can't just scream racism, you can't just accuse people of being racist. And it made me so aware of how overly sensitive people are if that's even mentioned. And also especially on a page that is for teachers, because you expect teachers to be better educated and to know better, but even among our colleagues, there's this offensiveness and defensiveness if racism is mentioned. What was also really annoying is that the post was taken down very quickly by admins because they said that it was too political and it was divisive and it was causing people to argue. So after that, myself and my husband started an ulterior group where things like race or politics, if you like, can be discussed without being closed down, because I think it's really important to have these discussions and they can't just be deleted, especially when people have put a lot of effort into replying to comments and challenging prejudices that they've seen. Next slide, thanks. And like Tony earlier, I was thinking about Paulo Freire today. And there's a quote where he said that it's, sorry, I can't see it but you'll be able to hopefully see it on your screen. It's a bit obscured on my screen, but basically he says that education is a political act. And as teachers, whether we like it or not, our jobs are political. It shouldn't be seen as something that's distasteful to mention. And also not acting is political, to not talk about race or gender or the things that affect the society and the young people that we teach. It's political to not mention it. You're choosing to side with oppression and do the young people a disservice by not talking to them about it, not giving them the vocabulary that they need to recognise the issues that they face and be able to talk about it. It also gets me back to thinking about people like Martin Luther King, who I've taught about before. But again, I realised recently that I didn't even really fully understand Martin Luther King properly. We all know about his "I Have a Dream" speech and all this talk about, you know, racial harmony, but there was also famous quotes. Martin Luther King had said things like the people who frustrated him most of all were the white moderates, the white people who weren't particularly racist. You know, they weren't going after anybody, but they were still compliant because they weren't on their side. They were not being political, not being involved. And he was most frustrated with these people as being the biggest obstacle. So I don't see race, again, that's something that people say quite a lot. I'm colourblind, I don't see race, I don't care. And I think I kind of fell into this spectrum for quite a long time before I really started to learn about it and look into it properly. It is a bit of a cop-out really, because if you're saying that you don't see race, you're sort of denying that people do experience racism. It is their lived experience. You're sort of only seeing it from your own lens. I have been someone who didn't see it before. I knew it existed, but I didn't think it existed here in Scotland, and I was quite blind to the fact that it could even happen here. So that's also got me thinking about the current climate. There's a lot of things in the media about how in England there's certain topics that are being considered too political to be spoken about. The media are saying things like Black Lives Matter maybe shouldn't be getting spoken about in schools. I found an article about this from The Independent recently by Camille London Mayo. She said, as an experienced Black educator, I wasn't surprised at the latest pushback against the development of a truly anti-racist and inclusive national curriculum. The latest EFA guidance for PSHE programme states that schools should not use resources produced by organisations that take extreme political stances on matters. Examples of extreme political stances include a publicly stated desire to abolish or overthrow democracy, capitalism, opposition to the right of freedoms of speech, or organisations that promote victim narratives that are harmful to British society. I think the victim narrative bit is particularly harmful because I think that's like gaslighting. Again, it's not listening to people when they talk about their lived experiences and denying the problem, and it's just closing down the conversation. So as I say, I'm someone who's trying to learn, and I definitely don't know it all. I definitely don't have it all figured out, have all the answers yet, but I'm certainly trying to educate myself as I go along by listening to people, by reading as much as I can, and by listening to my pupils as well. I've got children in my class who have already experienced racism. A boy in my class in a local park was getting told that he shouldn't be here, he doesn't belong here. Although what was encouraging is that it was his white friends that told me about that, and they were outraged by it. So there is some hope as well. So I would say any white person who's looking to learn more, I think the book Why I'm No Longer Talking About Race is a real eye-opener. And I think as a teacher, looking into decolonising the curriculum is something that's really helpful. It'll make you really aware of just how whitewashed our curriculum is and how much of a disservice we're doing to the young people that we teach at times. Even if we think that we're doing well, and we mean well, and we're doing all the things, we're talking about Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King, there's so much more to it than that, and much more to it than just looking at Black history once a year. Thanks.
Gemma, thank you so much for your input there. Really interesting that you've started to develop this from just a provocation that your lecturer gave you from studying your master's. I have to say it's a really catchy thing, Gemma. Before you know it, you'll be doing your PhD, so just be mindful. I think it's fantastic, and I think, Gemma, what's lovely there is you've talked about the beginning of your journey as a white educator, getting to first develop your own understanding of race and racism, and then beginning to ask questions and think critically. And I think you'll find that when you want to develop that allyship, Gemma, is speaking to some of your BME colleagues who are also doing this work. But what happens is they end up doing it quietly within their classrooms for fear of somebody saying, why are you talking about this? Why are you trying to shed light on this? So they face those extra challenges when they want to decolonise the curriculum. And so if they're working alongside their fellow white colleagues, it becomes even more so powerful. So using that privilege, Gemma, to be able to take those conversations on. Just very quickly, I am very conscious of our time. Now we need time to discuss. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of important points you raised. You talked about this, the understanding is so important. It's not just about bad people who have extremist views. The post-racial era, this colourblind approach is so important, and that myth of sameness. Maybe it's a well-intentioned teacher saying, I treat everybody the same. We need to talk about equality versus equity. Playing the race card, many of our BME teachers have already said are fearful of that when they think that they speak up, they will be seen as troublesome or oversensitive. That pyramid you shared with us, a fabulous image. It just shows how very quickly the progressive nature, the toxic nature of racism and how it can escalate. And so that paradigm shift of looking at our curriculum, turning the gaze, and what I think what you said beautifully was listening to your pupils. It's so important. We have allies in our classrooms, folks, and our young people will be our effective allies as well. Let's do some shared agency. Let's co-produce our curriculum with our young people. So thank you, Gemma, for sharing with us that, and it allows other practitioners to begin to think about how they can start their own journey as well. So folks, without further ado, I want to just say a huge thank you to our panel speakers. They've really prompted and given us many provocations to take forward into the breakout rooms. Please use the breakout room to generate questions for our panel. We do encourage you, if you can, to use the breakout room, but appreciate all may not be able to at an evening event. So if you'd prefer not to take part, we will be showing a 15-minute YouTube video talk by Robin DiAngelo, who talks about white privilege, a really powerful clip. This will also be posted in the chat so you can watch it later. So if you don't want to do it, you ignore the breakout room pop-up request and stay in the main session. But if you do, then please click on it and accept. We have 15 minutes in the breakout room, and then we'll return to get times for about half an hour time for question and answer later on. But please do remember to take notes for your questions to bring back to our panel, and I'll look forward to seeing you again in 15 minutes.
I'm Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and my work focuses on the question of what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race. Draw your attention to the fact that I'm white. So just look at me for a moment, think about it, notice it. And part of being white is that it's a very uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance in it. And that's because as a white person, I was socialized to see race as what they had. I was just a person. I was just a white bread, a Heinz 57. I didn't have race. I was socialized to see race as individual acts of discrimination and prejudice, individual acts that anybody could do to anybody else. And if you did those acts, you were a bad person. And that is why, since I saw myself as a good person, I didn't see myself as connected to racism, and certainly didn't see myself as connected to race. In other words, I didn't have a sense of a racial identity. Today, I understand that I move through the world always and most particularly as a white person. I have a white frame of reference, and I have a white experience. And part of being white is to have that be invisible to us and to be able to live our lives without ever acknowledging that, to see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on, and that all our institutions were created out of. And every institution reinforces this system. And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was racist. And that seems like a positive thing, right? Racism's bad. But unfortunately, what it morphed into is to make it impossible for white people to look at racism, because what we hear is, I would have to be a bad person in order to perpetuate racism. It became a moral issue. In addition to years of reflection and study of my own racial identity and how it shapes my life and my experience and my perspectives, I've had the very rare opportunity to, for a living, day in and day out, lead primarily white groups of people in discussions of race and racism. And there are some very, very predictable patterns that come up in these conversations. And as I listen to these, it's almost like a script, right? It's almost as if as white folks we just pick up this script and we say the same things again and again and again. And as a sociologist, rather than seeing something that's patterned as meaning therefore it's true, I look at something patterned as very revealing of how we get socialized to see things and to see the world. And then the next question that follows that is, and so how does that function? Right? And when we look around us, we can see that although we have changes since the civil rights movement and we have this idea of racism being bad, we still have the same unequal outcomes by race. By every measure, we have racial inequality. So how do we have such different narratives than we had prior to the civil rights movement and still have unequal outcomes? And as I listen to white folks, my group, repeat these narratives over and over, I got this image of a dock, like a pier, and it's just floating on the water, and that's all the superficial things that we say. And you probably recognize some of these, you hear them, maybe you've said them yourself. I don't see color, I was taught to treat everybody the same, I don't care if you're pink, blue, purple, polka dotted, my parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist, or my parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. It doesn't really matter what goes in front of it, the answer is always, I'm not racist, I know people of color, I used to work in the military. All of the things we say to rationalize that we ourselves are not complicit in this system. Now, I want to speak to two of these before I kind of take us below the surface of the dock. And one is this idea that our parents taught us to treat everyone the same. And I am just going to put it out there like this. No, they didn't. That is not humanly possible. Human beings are not objective. You cannot be taught to treat or to see everyone the same. And when you say that, you're indicating that you don't understand how socialization works, which is actually a positive thing in the sense that that can direct what you would need to focus on if you want to get deeper understanding. The other one I want to speak to is this common trope of, I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. If that's in your vocabulary, I would urge you to please drop it and never say it again. Although it isn't intentional, it's actually very demeaning. People don't come in those colors, and what it conveys is that you're not prepared to engage with authenticity. And that's why I have this image of a dog, right? That's very superficial surface. And for me, in trying to understand how all this works, what it means to be white, and live so separate by race, even though I was taught to see myself individually as open-minded and outside of all of this, I've had to go under the surface. And that's why I have this image here now. Under the water, you see the pier, the pillars, or posts that prop up the surface, okay? So, for example, it's very common in discussions of race to have white people tell you about all the people of color in their lives, right? Oh, I have these coworkers, or my best friend, or my second cousin married a black man, or all of the ways that we want everyone to know that we have a relationship with people of color, okay? And so, we're giving you evidence, right? When someone tells you that, they're giving you evidence. So what are they giving you evidence of? They're giving you evidence that because they love people of color, know and love people of color, they can't be racist, which means they see racism as conscious dislike or explicit bias or hatred, right? And they're communicating to you that they don't have conscious dislike or hatred, as evidenced by all of these people in their lives. And what we don't understand is the power of implicit bias. Most bias is unconscious. And that makes it very, very dangerous because it drives our behaviors, but we're not aware of it. Yes, it's individualism as a very powerful prop or support, this idea that each of us is unique and outside of socialization. We see universalism, which is kind of the opposite of individualism. Individualism says, why can't we all be different? And universalism says, why can't we all be the same? This is a very popular ideology in religious or faith communities. And I'm not arguing that on a deep spiritual level, we're not all universally the same, but we don't live, if you will, in the spiritual realm. We live in the physical realm. And here in the physical realm, we have to ask ourselves, how does it function to say, are we all clean under the skin? Well, it functions to take race off the table, to take power off the table, to deny that we have fundamentally different experiences, because racism is real. And while race isn't real, in other words, at the biological level, there is no real, true race or racial difference as we're taught to understand it, these very superficial signifiers of racial difference that allow us to categorize people, these are very real in their consequences for people's lives. And this insistence that we're all one doesn't allow us to engage with that social reality. I try to help white people see how race functions in our lives. And I try to move us away from the really obvious, evident examples, such as a racist joke or a racist action, or things that would be recognizable to everybody, right? The kinds of acts that cause people like me, well-meaning people like me, to say, I couldn't possibly be racist, I don't do those things. And I try to help white people understand racism as the very fabric of our society. And I think the most profound example of everyday racism is segregation. That most white people live in racial segregation. While we may work with people of color, when we go home, people of color are rarely at our dinner table. And I don't mean setting our table. I mean sitting and breaking bread with us, true relationships in our lives.
Welcome everybody back from your breakout rooms, or if you decide to stay in the main session to watch the Robin DiAngelo clip. But welcome all. Now we're kind of moving into the opportunity for you to ask questions of our panel. So can we perhaps just remind you to try to keep your questions as succinct as possible, and let us know who you are directing the question to, so that we can invite the panel speakers to respond. Or if it's one for all the panel, please do say. So I don't know, Selma, are you wanting me to keep an eye on the chat here, or are we just inviting questions from people unmuting and raising their hand?
If you could please indicate in the chat what your question is and who it's directed to, and then we'll call on you if you would like to present it yourself. Alternatively, type it in the chat and Khadija will direct it.
Okay, there's one question just now which I can take, and it was around the point about equalities subsuming anti-racist issues, hard to challenge in schools. Any tips? So does anybody from our panel want to speak to this? Tony, can I invite you to maybe have a go?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you repeat the question again, please? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So there was a point made about equality subsuming anti-racist issues. Hard to challenge in schools. Any tips?
Well, I mean, I'll go with what we normally usually talk. If you want to challenge anything, yeah, you have to be diplomatic. I mean, this is not about confronting, head along. because obviously it's a quite emotionally charged subject, you know. So obviously, don't stay silent. If you see some any malfeasance or bad practices going on, it's up to you to stand up and challenge, because this thing is about not being silent, you know. So, but it's also how you do it. You know, you have to be very diplomatic. You know, I mean, we talked about elegant challenge, you know, so that you don't come across as being too intimidating. You know, do you know what I mean? And then, you know, it's like, the way I would look at it is like, when you're dealing with people who don't understand where you're coming from, you have to have a little bit of compassion. You understand what I'm saying? For, you know, a little bit of compassion to say, like, you know, they don't know what I know. You know what I'm saying? If you like, you know, and it's because it's all about the education process, you know. And so, and if you think like that, then you would not have like headlong collision with management or whoever is responsible on whatever equality issue you have to deal with. So you have to sort of develop your strategy, read up on equality issues, know the rights, because I mean, all public institutions have a public service equality duty. So I mean, you've got it there, you know, Johnson, to use, you know. But also build a team of people around you, because you cannot do it alone. This is not a job that you can do on your own. Build a team of people around you who you normally share ideas, and you're thinking along the same lines. So you can have, you know, it's like building capacity, if you like. So you can, you know, it's building capacity. So you have a group. If you have a group that, you know, then you can begin to, you know, call them. I mean, the best way I can look at it is like, I listened to, what's her name? The head of the tradition, what's her, O'Grady, the O'Grady woman. She gave the Jimmy Reid the talk in a city council, the Glasgow City Council chambers in 2018, I think. Frances O'Grady, that's right. And she was saying when she went to Germany, what happened was, like, the way in Germany they were doing it, right, you know, in the local communities, right, the people were actually inviting the fascists and the, you know, the rednecks or whatever you call them, you know what I mean? People who are, you know, who are that way, you know, and having them have a session within the community and engaging them and try to educate them, because this is the thing, you know, it's all, you know, I mean, most people are not taught, you know, I mean, this thing is not taught in the schools, you know what I mean? So I mean, it's a big thing we're trying to do here. Do you know what I'm saying? And you on your own cannot do it. So build coalition, build capacity, you know, and elegant challenge, diplomatic challenge.
Thank you, Tony. Tony, I'm going to bring in.
Yeah, that's all I can say, you know.
Thank you. I think Larry wants to come in there as well. So, Larry.
Just very briefly, Khadija, I think there's two elements to it. One is actually curriculum.
Yeah.
And there needs to be an embedding in the curriculum, an anti-racist perspective, which doesn't even have to be highlighted as anti-racist education, but it should simply be intrinsic in the nature of the curriculum that we are delivering for young people. And that's where I think, you know, bodies like ourselves, in terms of our input to pedagogical practice, should be working on that. You know, one of the issues is that the anti-racism in the colleges, you know, teacher training colleges, has been marginalised, along with a number of other issues. You know, it's like an afternoon's lecture. So we need to, in terms of practice, professional practice, it needs to be in the curriculum. And then the other aspect of it is, and this is maybe where the broader equalities agenda can smother anti-racism, is that in secondaries in particular, it becomes part of social education, you know, personal social education. And there's a tendency to tick a big box by doing a generic equality subject. And I think that's where we do need to actually do a bit of work around. Clearly there are connections to be made, but there are also discrete aspects that need to be explored further. And I think there's a general squeezing of time around actually equalities across the board. So, you know, we need to avoid being in a hierarchy of which inequality deserves more prominence, but we need to actually have all inequalities feature much more strongly in the work of our schools.
Yeah, absolutely, Larry. And it's also around the sort of the political steer also that comes from that, between the equalities, the protected characteristics. And certainly for when we talk about equality and diversity, sometimes I just think that using words like diversity is quite safe, and calling it what it is, and Teresa's practice, is sometimes quite important, because what happens is we lose the critical edge of those discussions around social justice when we refer to it as diversity. I'm wondering, Gemma, can I bring you in, because obviously from a school perspective, you're doing all this wonderful work within your own school, and you'll be doing it perhaps, or discussing it within the equalities agenda in your school. How are you navigating that? What challenges have you faced with particular colleagues? Because one thing I'm absolutely aware of is, when I've done some research around white allyship, I came across a fantastic article that talked about the challenges of becoming a white ally. And that was actually white colleagues saying, by golly, I'm even finding some challenges here. So it's interesting, because for a white colleague to be challenged, you think about the challenges that your fellow people of colour might experience. But can you share with us any challenges you faced in taking this work forward?
I think that's it exactly. Like, when you realise that as a white person, it's difficult for you, but you then have to think, if it's hard for me, how much harder is it for anybody else? I think as a white educator, you've got to try as much as you can to take responsibility for challenging it.
Yeah.
I was saying in the breakout room there, with the American election and things coming up, I think the more educated and aware you are, the braver you get. When Donald Trump was first elected and I was asked about racism, I think I might have skirted around it, whereas just today, when I was asked, do you think he's racist? I said, I don't think he is. I know he is. And just not being afraid to have these conversations. And if parents complain, they complain. I mean, they can if they want to. You know that you're doing the right thing, and that all the research, GTCS and people like that would back you up.
So backlash from parents, Gemma, is what you're referring to here as well, about the work you're doing?
Yeah, I haven't experienced it in my setting just now, but certainly a few years ago, I was warned to be very careful not to mention the Olympic refugee team. I had to send out letters to warn people that I'd be talking about these things, and now I find that just absurd. I wouldn't have that now. I'm kind of glad that I'm not in that school anymore, but yeah, it was as if there was this fear of talking about it, and fear of offending white parents who might want to complain about your political agenda.
And I think that comes back to the point Larry's made there earlier about, equalities and anti-racism being subsumed. This really has to be the work of a whole school community. So when we're thinking about a school community, how are we going to create perhaps a race statement? I mean, we start to get jittery when we talk about policy. So, we've got a local authority policy, but a race statement in our school that has the head teacher, some teachers, the janitor, the lollipop person who's helping children to cross the road. All of them need to be around the table and having those discussions, so that we're not having that kind of pushback from various stakeholders. I'm conscious Rachel Yates wants to come in, and she's posed this question. I can't see the question though, Selma. Could you help me out there? Is the question around white educators?
The question currently being discussed was posed by Rachel. She wants to comment just to clarify.
Of course. Sorry, Rachel, in you come.
Hi. Yeah, I just posted it because I've been part of a group who it was seen as a problem-solving group, and a few of us had been thinking about anti-racist practice and thinking about how can we tackle that in school. And it has kind of been now subsumed. We've become an overall equalities group, and I'm finding it really hard to know the way forward, because obviously I don't want to downplay the fact that it's really important that LGBT issues are tackled, and it's really important that disability issues are tackled. But there is a sort of flavour of perhaps it being a really difficult topic, very tricky, very political, and people are quite fearful about it. What will people say about our school if it's found out that we're needing this? So that's why I asked the question, because it was really interesting to hear that named by Larry and talked about by other people. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Rachel. Some really important points that you've raised as well there. And I think maybe the crux of that is the perhaps a lack of awareness and understanding of the key concepts themselves. And so therefore teachers are reluctant to engage for fear of perhaps offending or being politically incorrect. And it's about getting over that. It's that leaning into that discomfort, isn't it? And I wonder, you know, the EIS have produced some fantastic resources as well, Rachel, you know, like our books around the myths of immigration. You know, we've got some great starting points to start conversations within our staff rooms, within, you know, with just our colleagues together. So maybe perhaps we need to kind of flag them up now and again regularly as well, because that does bring forward more critical discussions. Another question has just come in there: how can teachers best go about setting up anti-racist groups or starting local anti-racist conversations? I'm wondering if I can come to Tony on that one again. You're on mute, Tony.
Sorry, guys. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I mean, take for example, in my case, you know, it's obviously not easy, but you have to convince yourself that this is something you want to do, and you need to be bold enough and start. Because, for example, like at my institution, I mean, I started a BME group just like what people are saying. For me, after Trump and things like that, I did start one last year, but it's very difficult because when you know, for people, you know, to engage with things, because it's still seen as a taboo subject, you know. But now with the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, even though for me, I always look at the Black Lives Matter as just like the grotesque, you know, it's more of this institutional. Just find people who, like-minded people. You start off with like-minded people who think like you, and try to build a small group, slowly, you know, start small, and then it could go. If people see that what you're doing is beneficial. Also, as a teacher, I was going to say this when Larry was talking about the curriculum. The curriculum is given to you. You as a teacher has the agency, right, to interpret it. That's your job. So, I mean, so ways, and these are all ways of thinking around it. So if people see that what you're doing is beneficial, then they will join in. They will join in. And there's no, for me, it's just be committed to do it. And then find like-minded people that you can start talking to, you know, because, you know, for me, it's very important for the momentum to be kept. You know, do you know what I mean? Now that it's in the media, you know, after the Black Lives Matter is in the media, and God alone knows what's going to happen after today. I don't even want to talk about that. You know what I mean? It's going to still be to keep it in your radar and keep talking, not just because of Black History Month. You say, okay, like Gemma was saying, Martin Luther King. You know, do you know what I mean? This is easy. Try to engage, because what we're talking about here is like decolonizing the curriculum, which means so many things. You know what I'm saying? You know, when you talk about decolonizing, you have, for me, when you talk about decolonizing the curriculum, you have to say what you mean. You have to delineate, you know, because it means so many things. Yeah. So, but it's also like, if we call it education reparation, yeah, because it's not been taught. Most of these people have not been taught that in school. Yeah. So start groups with, you know, small groups, like-minded people, having, even if it's just a lunchtime discussion, reading books and things, because it should be your drive, you know, do you know what I mean? And building coalition, solidarity, and getting, you know, do you know what I mean? That's what I did. I tried to build, you know, a group around me. It's not easy. There's always people thinking about their jobs. They want to protect their jobs. There's all that internal dynamics, politics going on in all these institutions. But that should not stop you, you know.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah.
Gemma, just very quickly, is there anything, maybe with the work that you've been doing in your school, have you set up some kind of, discussion group or staff group looking into anti-racist practice?
Not within my staff group as a whole, but we started a new Facebook group where we would have these discussions and somebody wouldn't be able to delete them. So most of my colleagues have joined that group. Yeah, it was just quite mind-blowing that you can't even discuss racism without the topic getting deleted for being political. So we've created this group to allow that kind of discussion at least to happen with, as Tony said, with like-minded people.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
also within my own school, I've just tried to make a big effort to just really make sure that I'm teaching the whole curriculum properly, and there's no point teaching World War II without the whole story. There's no point making us the hero in it and not teaching the kids the truth about what happened.
Yeah. No, that's great, Gemma. Someone's put in there that is the Facebook group open to all, so I'm sure you'll find some new members there. Larry, do you want to say anything about that question?
Just 2 points. I mean, I think it depends a bit on the context of your school. What's the best vehicle? So, in a secondary school, I would actually be looking to some of the students as a catalyst for raising this. And upper primary as well. But there's two issues. One, I think one of the ways of engaging people who are more reluctant, in a kind of political or being anti-political sense, it's just to remind people that as a professional in Scotland, you are committed to the GCSE standards, which call upon you to challenge discrimination in all its forms. So I think there's a kind of pedagogical, professional hook to pull people in, and maybe negate some of their concerns by saying, not only are you allowed to do this, you are expected to do this because otherwise you're not meeting the standards. And then the other part of it is just in relation to the pupils. Without opening up a discussion around Curriculum for Excellence, right? One of the things that Curriculum for Excellence has done is actually to broaden out how we operate in schools from more than just attainment and assessment. And it was very interesting. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but the a set of PISA results were issued last week from the 2018 survey. So I think it was volume 6. But this was around students' awareness of the world around them, their ability to empathise, with those in trouble in other parts of the world. And Scotland came out fourth highest, globally. And I do think that's a reflection of the fact that in our system, values is a key foundation for how we actually, seek to deliver the curriculum. It didn't get a lot of publicity, probably if it came out bottom, would have got more headlines. But it was actually, I think, a big tick for the idea that our system is set up to actually do this. We shouldn't be having to fight against what maybe some of our colleagues in England are having to fight against in terms of policy directors, because in Scotland there is a system buy-in to the idea of values underpinning what we should be delivering in our schools.
Thank you, Larry. I think your point, absolutely, the one you made earlier about pupils, for me it comes down to true differentiation, isn't it? We just need to look at our pupil population and think we absolutely owe it to them to have those discussions. And that doesn't mean whether you have a diverse pupil population, but for any communities. In fact, I would argue it's those predominantly schools that are from a homogenous ethnic background need to have those conversations. So setting up any staff group to discuss, or any staff pupil group, would be particularly powerful. But again, I can understand there are challenges when you do that. Another question.
Can you just, one small point I meant to make is we cannot develop critical thinking in our students unless we deal with the world that they see on their screens, that they read, that they hear about. So, this is an imperative for the system to give young people the skills to understand Trump and what racism is and why Black Lives Matter is a campaign they should support.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting wound up now.
Thank you. Folks, are there any further questions? Just a last opportunity to ask a question. Otherwise, what I might propose is, given that we're talking about allyship and the importance of listening to counter-narratives, the storytelling, the power of storytelling when we ask you to walk into the shoes of people who have the lived experience, I'm mindful, Tony, you had some stories to share with us, and if we've got no further questions, I might invite you for the next couple of minutes before we close, just to share one of your stories with us, Tony. So if we've got no further questions from the floor, are we okay? Anybody wanting to finally raise their hand? Tony, over to you.
I'll be quick. Yeah, I mean, I had it as I don't have my screen up with me, but I'll just talk through it briefly off my notes. The thing is like in my trajectory, this is the things that which I've experienced all throughout, you know, in different guises and different ways. So I mean, just to talk about the institutional racism. I mean, my uncle, you know, just to give a little bit background of myself, my uncle lived in this country for about 60 years. He came here when he was 18, you know, I mean, because it was the dumb thing. Sierra Leone, if you know, just to throw a little bit of history, yeah, Sierra Leone was actually created by Britain, you know, you know, was a British colony from 1808, and the education system was all designed according to a British perspective. So people coming here find no difficulties to engage with the society. So I mean, you see. It goes back to the 1900s. You know, I mean, you get soldiers coming from West Africa, fighting in the First World War, fighting in the Second War. Somebody mentioned that. You know, so that's the kind of relationship. And for me, when I look at Britain in particular, Britain has had like a long-standing relationship with my country that goes far back to the 16th century. If you go to the museum, right? If you go to the museum in Freetown, it says there, Sierra Leone, your most loyal nation, if you like. It says there. There's a plaque there which says there, you know. So that's kind of relationship. So for me, I don't separate the two in so many ways, in any ways. And so, but that's a part of my story, you know. It's like, I came to Scotland because I, like what people were saying earlier on just now, because, you know, my uncle has always said, I've lived here in this sceptred island, you used to say, because he's dead and gone now, but I've chosen to live in Glasgow. But I never used to think about that. You know, I mean, in London, me and my cousin would just come, you know, party in Glasgow and then go back, you know. But when he passed away and I came and I got a job and I began to, you know, I began to see the difference. But mind you, you know, I've also read Tariq Ali, you know. I read Street Fighter about his days in London, you know, do you know what I mean, from Oxford and all that kind of thing. And he's always said, like, you know, I get a good reception when I come to Glasgow. So in a way, when I moved to Glasgow in 2006, I consider myself to be now, I said to folks, I came to Glasgow to retire. I'm 60, by the way. You know, I look, you know, I just turned 60 this year. You know, I came to retire. So most of what, you know, my trajectory here as a lecturer has been hampered in so many ways, or, you know, I've been set back, if you like, because what people have to understand when you live in a racialized society, these are things that happen, but I mean, most people are not oblivious of but people don't know that it takes place unless you engage with people of marginalized communities and they talk to you and they explain that. Like I said, I consider myself an affinity Scot, and now there's much talk about new Scots, you know, and all that, which is a good thing, you know. I mean, 2014, I went to the Commonwealth Games. I listened to Tom Devine. There was a talk about Empire Cafe and things like that. These are all good things, you know, because, I mean, to happen in Glasgow, but I mean, still not happened yet. my trajectory at my institution I had similar experiences. But all I can say is, like, if you want to engage with my views, go to www.honoraryscotians.com. That's my website that, you know, I've set out where you can find some of my writing, you know, and because that's what I do, you know. I mean, that's what I came up here to do, to write, you know. But as people's trajectory in big cities go, I end up teaching ESOL, but I'm still there, you know. And I'm going to be doing that until I reach 6 score and 10, if you like. So that's part of my story in a way, you know. So www.honoraryscotians.com, right? It's a website which I just, you know, it's still in early days. So you can find some of my journalism. We explore some of these issues. I've got a piece there about the Battle of Georgetown, which is interesting. I'm interested because most of the key people who were involved were from Sierra Leone. The 6 people who were involved were Sierra Leoneans. Little did I know, I only found that out when I came here. So, I mean, these are things my uncle used to tell me about. But I mean, when you're in London, you don't look at, even my son, sort of, you know, things like that. You know, you look at, you know, this is a small place. London is the capital city, you know, and all that kind of thing. But yeah, I consider myself to be an affinity sport, and I want to see that things, you know, I mean, I was impressed to say the, you know, to say the truth, that there was an anti-racist education program going on, but it fell over the cliff. So that tells you something about Glasgow, you know what I mean? There's something about Glasgow, you know, which has the potential, not just Glasgow, Scotland has a, you know, a potential to be different, if you like, so to speak. So
Thank you, Tony.
I think I'll shut up now.
No, thank you so much, Tony. Your story is really valuable for us to hear.
So go www.honoraryscotians.com. Yeah.
Folks, really, thank you very much, Tony. I'm just conscious of time, and folk will be wanting to get their tea, but I just wanted to take a moment to thank our speakers. So Larry, Tony and Gemma, thank you so much for your contributions and provocations this afternoon, or early evening, should I say. Thank you to you, the participants, for engaging, and your questions kept the discussion going. And also the EIS staff for organising this event. Lee, you always keep me right with the Zoom links and so on, so thank you so much. Folks, just a reminder that the upcoming anti-racist training opportunities and guidance, so look at our website for further information. This is certainly not the end of the EIS anti-racist conversation. We will continue in our efforts and pick up further in our next webinar on the rise of the far right. And just in closing, folks, very quickly, I just wanted to talk to you about, you know, the take-home messages of today, I think. So as practitioners, if we're able to deconstruct, you know, our own whiteness as far as we can, we're better positioned to see why the prevailing pedagogical curricular patterns might not work for all our young people. But we need to think about strategies of how to become an effective white ally. So moving from awareness to allyship, so developing that nuanced understanding, being prepared to engage in a paradigm shift. So not being defensive at looking at white privilege, but working with your BME school community to check in with them and make sure that when you are in your well-intentioned ways wanting to decolonize the curriculum, that you might not be inadvertently reinforcing a stereotype, which is what we've seen happening in one of our Edinburgh schools. Centre the voices of the experiences of those who are marginalised. So as Larry said, talk to our young people, get to know them, and hear stories like Tony's story, because it really will help you to think about in solidarity and taking that action. We move away from the individual to systems, look at our school policies, look at our school curriculum, and look at how we can work together as an institution. But most importantly, it's about centering and recognising the efforts of Black and minority ethnic staff in your institution and our BME family communities. Watch out how they might be inadvertently being silenced or marginalised, and that their efforts and work are devalued. So there's a process of unlearning to be done, and race must firmly stay on the agenda. And I think we'll close it at that. So thank you so much for your engagement. It's been a wonderful session, and I look forward to seeing some of you in our next webinar. Thank you and good evening.
Thanks, Khadija, for brilliant sharing as always.
Thank you, Selma.